Welcome to the Broward County Climate Ambassador Training. This is an online session to teach you about climate impacts, what the county is doing, and for you to learn how to share your climate story. After taking these sessions, you should be better trained to have conversations with your friends, coworkers, colleagues about climate change and its impacts in Broward County and what you and others can do about it. I'm Jill Horwitz in the Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division of Broward County. Here are some of the other members on our Energy and Sustainability team. In this session, we will take between 20 and 30 minutes to learn about climate impacts. In other modules, you will learn about the county's initiatives and how to share your story. The first thing we will do in this session is some basic Climate 101. There's a difference between climate and weather, and this is really good to point out to people who are less informed about climate change. It's a good beginning to the conversation. This video on the right, you can look up on YouTube and watch. It's a great little introduction. Climate is what you expect over a long period of time, while weather is what you might see on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. So climate is the long-term trend, and weather is the variability around that trend. This helps to understand the difference between what we see on a daily basis and what we know is happening on the global scale over a long period of time. The greenhouse gas effect. When we look up at the sky, our atmosphere appears to go on forever. In reality, it's a very thin, very fragile layer of gases that protect the Earth from the rays of the sun and the coldness of space. Without it and this thermal blanket, we would not be able to have life on our planet. The problem is that carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere are trapping heat, which is what they're supposed to do, but because we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, that blanket is getting thicker and trapping more heat, and that's why the globe is warming and causing multiple climate change impacts. Now, the burning of fossil fuels is the main cause of climate change. It's important to note that there are other contributors like deforestation, transportation, agriculture, and other industrial processes. So as we'll see, the way that we build and live affects the Earth's climate. We've seen an increase in global carbon emissions from fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. It's important to note that we all have a carbon footprint. When we look at numbers, which we're going to do in a couple of minutes, you'll see how much each household contributes to climate change. But it's hard to make the numbers real. I really like this picture because some students at a university once had this large installation, and it showed what 1 ton of carbon dioxide looks like. That's a really good visual to help us understand the impact of our daily actions. There's also a really neat interactive website by the Department of Energy. The link is at the bottom of the slide. You can pull this up and see how much each state compares with each other in the US and different countries around the world on the average emissions per capita. That's also a great activity. You can pause now and do that if you like. In Broward County, our household carbon footprint is a whopping 43.6 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Remember how much 1 ton of carbon looked like from the previous image? In Broward, we average 43 tons per year. Mostly that comes from transportation and electricity use at home and at work. But you can see that what we eat, what we buy, and the services that we pay for also really add up to our carbon footprint. That means that making sustainable and low carbon choices can really help. In Broward County, in total, we have a carbon footprint of 25 million metric tons per year. That's the equivalent to 54 billion pounds of CO2. So you can see that what we do locally really matters because we are contributing to a global problem that's affecting us too. And how do we know this? We have 2,000 years of carbon and global temperature data. And what we can see by looking at the trend is that as carbon dioxide increases, so does the temperature. Remember the first graph with the man walking the dog? Yes, there is variation, but when we look over a long time, you can see the important trend. Now, if you look closely at the graph, which you should always do, you'll notice that the temperature variation is about 1 degree. That doesn't really seem significant, but when we consider it globally, 1 degree is the difference between ice and water. It's causing the thermal expansion of the oceans. The majority of heat from global warming is being trapped by the oceans, actually. But the problem is we're not sure how much more they can hold. This is an unknown. The additional heat is also causing issues in marine ecosystems, which we'll touch on in a moment. This is a fun game to try if you're leading a discussion or activity. It's called the loaded climate dice game. What you do is you break the room into 2 groups and use a chart to record the rolls of dice. Each team takes a turn rolling their dice. We've taped different impacts on each side, little images of hurricanes and whatnot, and then we've also added the relative cost to the community to each of those. For example, summer shower or a sunny day costs a community $0 to respond to. Flooding costs $50,000, drought $100,000, heat wave $150,000, and hurricanes $200,000. You can use Monopoly money to see which team or community runs out of money first. We put pictures of each type of weather on the sides and the costs listed. Now the trick here is that you secretly load the dice. Make one team's dice be weighted so that they get more hurricanes when they roll. What the group should learn is that weather fluctuates, which can make it easy for us to notice the long-term trend, but that there is one. Almost a quarter of a century ago, James Hansen, the NASA scientist who put climate change on the global agenda, suggested the analogy of loaded dice. Using dice to represent probabilities of a hot, average, or cold summer, he predicted that by the early 21st century, 4 of the 5 faces would be red, 1 white, and 1 blue. Hot summers would be much more frequent, but there still would be cold summers now and then. And so it has proved true. As he documented in a new paper, Dr. Hansen and others concluded that cold summers, by historic standards, still happen but rarely, while hot summers have in fact become twice as prevalent. And as we all know, 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2000. So we are living this truth already. Okay, so now that you have the basic Climate 101, we're going to talk about the local impacts, which are really important. Now, as we all know, sea level rise is the primary local impact that we worry about climate change in South Florida. There are other local impacts that we want to point you to and orient you to. We will go through these in more detail. They are sea level rise, coastal and inland flooding, saltwater intrusion, extreme rainfall, beach erosion, ocean acidification, temperature extremes, more frequent and severe drought, habitat change and hardiness zone shifts, and vector-borne diseases. Sea level rise is the primary climate impact that we expect and are already experiencing in South Florida. Overall, we expect to see 2 feet of sea level rise by 2060, and we use this information to understand which areas of our community will be impacted first. This is the unified sea level rise projection that is used by the 4 counties, Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, and Monroe County in the Keys, to plan for climate change. We'll talk about this more later. It's just been updated. You'll learn more in Module 2. While sea level rise affects how and where we can build, it also affects more than that. It affects the quality and availability of our drinking water supply. As salt water pushes in from the ocean to our underground aquifer, it also rises and it begins to pull water into our wells. Over time, the saltwater intrusion line, that red line on the map in the far right, has moved inland in some places as much as 6 miles. That means those wells are no longer functioning as they should and had to be moved. Now notice how that well looks like a giant straw? One thing that we can all do is to conserve water. so that we're pulling on that straw less. Did you know that more than half of all household water is used outside the home? Converting your lawn to native plants is not only more beautiful and creates habitat for birds, pollinators, and other beneficial animals, it also saves a lot of water because the plants are accustomed to our climate and they don't have to be watered as much. Look up Naturescape Broward for more information. Another climate change impact is tidal flooding. You might have heard this in the news recently. It's when the sun, the moon, and the earth are aligned, and so the tides are higher than usual. This is happening today anywhere from 2 to 24 days per year. With sea level rise, we expect the impact of king tides to be stronger. By 2030, we expect 45 of these king tide days, and by 2045, we expect over 200 of these flooding days in our coastal areas. This is more than just inconvenient. It makes it hard for people to get around to school, to work, for their normal activities in the coastal neighborhoods. This is a picture in our Hollywood community. There's also a correlation between sea level rise and rising groundwater levels. In the coastal areas in Broward, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, which means with 1 foot of sea level rise, we see already a 1 foot rise in groundwater. In our western communities, it's about half as much, 0.5 to 1. If our groundwater table is higher, there's less storage capacity in the soil to absorb rainfall. Precipitation models show that we will actually have less rainfall overall throughout the year, but an increased intensity in storms. That means when we do get rain, it might be all at once, which is hard for our drainage systems to handle. And we already see this happening. Here are a couple examples of some 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 year storms that we've seen in recent years. We have many more examples of these all throughout our community. These storms should be happening only 1 in 100 years or 1 in 1,000 years. That's the prediction, but we're seeing them much more often, and that means that our communities are challenged to deal with the amount of rainfall we're getting because the systems are not designed to handle that much water in that short a period of time. We need better models that will predict how much water we will see on our land and our land's capacity to drain that water so that our communities are sustainable and resilient for everyone. All that water is not just inconvenient, it's also very expensive. Remember when Sawgrass Mills was closed for 3 days? Approximately $4 million in lost revenue was caused by that storm per day. Another climate impact we're already seeing is increased beach erosion from high tide events and storms. You might remember in 2012 when Superstorm Sandy took out A1A in Fort Lauderdale. It didn't even go on shore, it was just offshore, and still there was incredible damage from that storm. It took out the sidewalk and half the road. When that road was replaced, it was reinforced, and they also put dunes in to add as natural protection. This creates more nesting habitat for turtles too, so it's a win-win. We have to realize that coral reefs, beach dunes, and mangroves are all lines of defense, stopping wave action and helping to protect the roads and homes on the coast beyond them. When we protect nature, nature protects us. Green infrastructure is a really good investment. Warmer, more acidic oceans and more runoff and increased sediment leads to impacts on our coral reef system. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean and makes carbonic acid. Marine species that use carbonate to build their skeletons and shells, like corals and mollusks, may be harmed because the acid formed in the water uses up the carbonate before they can. That's why ocean acidification is causing such damage to the marine ecosystem and why we're seeing coral bleaching and die-off. It's hotter up here on land too. Historically, we've seen about 11 days over 95 degrees. But in the near future, we expect to see in Florida 75 days or more of these extreme temperatures. Elevated temperatures can lead to increased energy consumption because we're using the air conditioner more, and that will lead to greater emissions. Not only will it be uncomfortably hot more days out of the year, this also will exacerbate climate change. Trees can also help to keep our homes and neighborhoods cooler. Notice that projection for hotter days is anywhere from 2041 to 2070. So start planting more trees today. In 20 years, your neighborhood could be very green and a whole lot cooler. Heat waves are also of concern. We have to think how we're going to deal with these types of emergencies, especially our vulnerable populations. What about those that can't afford AC or an increased AC bill? The vulnerable will become even more vulnerable with climate change. Across all impacts, this is true. Especially in South Florida, we need to think about humidity. When you combine heat and humidity, you can have more of these extreme danger days. We are changing from a subtropical to a tropical climate. This means that our habitat and hardiness zones are shifting upward. That means there's a geographic shift in species ranges and a shift in their life cycle events. For example, some of our plants may bloom and fruit earlier than normal, which means that they won't be a food source for the migrating birds that come through every year. This can make the whole ecosystem out of sync and cause tremendous impacts to these plants and animals. And it's not just the plants and animals that are shifting. Vectorborne disease zones are also shifting. Remember when there was Zika a couple years ago? That's linked to warming temperatures as well. The last climate impact that I want to touch on is the likelihood of drought. I know in this module we talked mostly about there being too much water, but if you remember the precipitation slide, there's less water overall predicted. Drought affects farmers, our wetlands and ecosystems, and our ability to recharge the aquifer. So to review, you learned some basic Climate 101, climate versus weather, the greenhouse gas effect, carbon footprints, carbon dioxide and global temperature, thermal expansion of the oceans, and loading the climate dice. You also learned about 10 local impacts: sea level rise, coastal and inland flooding, saltwater intrusion, extreme rainfall, beach erosion, ocean acidification, temperature extremes, more frequent and severe drought, habitat changes and hardiness zone shifts, and vector-borne diseases. This concludes Module 1 of the Climate Ambassador Training. If you have any questions, please contact us at resilience@broward.org. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know that you took this training and what you thought of it. Look at our station on YouTube at Broward Environment to find the other modules of your training. Module 2, County Initiatives, and Module 3, Share Your Story. Thank you so much for becoming a Broward Climate Ambassador.